The sound was definitive, a solid, metallic click that echoed briefly in the stone-walled room before being swallowed by the silence. It was the sound of a heavy lock engaging, a sound that, in an instant, redefined the reality for the 5 people standing in the wine cellar of Ashford Manor. Cornelius Whitmore had his hand wrapped around the neck of a Bordeaux bottle, his mind, for a moment, refusing to process what his ears had just registered. Behind him, his wife Beatrice turned from the ledger she'd been studying, the rustle of her silk dress suddenly loud in the quiet. From the corner, their daughter Margaret's voice cut through the stillness, sharp with a privileged impatience honed over a lifetime of getting her way. "What was that?" she asked. It was a question that didn't need an answer because they all knew. They simply couldn't believe it. Thomas, the son, was the first to move, his boots scraping against the cold stone as he lunged for the heavy oak door. His hand closed around the iron handle and he pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, his shoulder now pressed against the solid wood, his face contorted with the effort. The door didn't budge. It was as immovable as the limestone that surrounded them. "It's locked," Thomas said, his voice more confused than alarmed. That would come later. Cornelius set the bottle down with deliberate care, as if maintaining control over this small gesture could somehow stop the larger situation from spiraling away from him. He was a man who commanded 300 acres of Georgia tobacco, a man who managed crops, accounts, and human property with the precision of a general. A locked door was a problem to be solved. He approached, straightened his waistcoat, and tried the handle himself. The iron was cold. The door remained shut. "Samuel!" Cornelius called out, his voice carrying the assumption of authority that had never been questioned within these walls. "Samuel, there's been some mistake. The door is locked behind you." He waited. Silence answered him. Not an empty silence, but a thick, listening silence. Then they all heard it, the sound of footsteps directly above them, not hurried but slow, methodical and deliberate, moving across the first-floor hallway. They could track Samuel Oak's progress through his own home by sound alone. "Samuel!" Thomas shouted, pounding his fist against the oak. The impact produced a dull, thudding sound that was absorbed by the wood. "Open this door immediately. This isn't amusing." The footsteps paused. For a fleeting second, hope flickered in the cellar. Then the footsteps resumed, continuing their steady path toward the front of the house. They heard the distant creak of the main door opening, and then nothing. "He's left," Beatrice whispered, her hand rising to the pearl choker at her throat. "He's walked out of the house." The reality of their situation began to dawn, cold and slow, like the Georgia winter seeping through the stones. Disbelief was the first and most stubborn emotion. The architecture of their world, built over generations, could not accommodate this simple, brutal fact. They were prisoners in their own cellar. Cornelius refused to accept it. "Don't be absurd," he snapped at his wife, though his voice had lost its commanding edge. "Samuel has served this family for 15 years. He wouldn't. This is some misunderstanding. Perhaps the lock jammed." But even as he spoke, his mind was racing backward, sifting through the evening's events, searching for the moment control had slipped from his grasp. It had been Samuel who suggested they take inventory of the wine collection after supper. It had been Samuel who carried the lamp to the top of the cellar stairs. It had been Samuel who closed the door behind them, murmuring something about preventing a draft from affecting the wine temperature. It had all made perfect sense. Everything Samuel did made sense. That was his value. It was Constance, Beatrice's elderly mother, who spoke with the chilling clarity of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize an ending when it arrived. Seated on a small stool, her aged hands folded in her lap, she said quietly, "He's not coming back. That boy has locked us in here and he's walked away." Margaret laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Gone to fetch help? It's Saturday evening. Father dismissed all the house staff until Monday morning. You wanted a private family weekend. There is no one within 5 miles of this house except for us." She stopped, the final unspoken phrase hanging in the cold air. "And Samuel Oakes, who is gone." The full weight of their isolation began to press down on them. No staff, no expected visitors. The Henderson family, their closest neighbors, were in Charleston. The Reverend was in Augusta. It would be a minimum of 48 hours before anyone would have a reason to come to Ashford Manor. And when they did, would they even think to check the wine cellar? Would they hear their cries through 3 feet of stone and earth? The five of them stood in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the immense wealth of their wine collection, and began to understand the true meaning of helplessness. Action was the only antidote to the creeping dread. Cornelius and Thomas, men of property and action, decided to take charge. They would break the door down. Their eyes fell upon a heavy, floor-to-ceiling oak wine rack, laden with some of the manor's oldest and most valuable vintages. It was sturdy, solid, and heavy enough to serve as a battering ram. Together, father and son grunted and strained, maneuvering the massive rack away from the wall. Bottles clinked and rattled in protest. With a shared look of determination, they lifted the cumbersome structure, their muscles straining, veins bulging on their necks and foreheads. They took a running start and rammed it against the door. The impact was thunderous, a crash that sent vibrations through the stone floor and caused dust to drift down from the ceiling like fine snow. The door, however, did not shudder. It did not splinter. It stood, immovable and absolute. The wine rack, on the other hand, splintered along one side. 3 bottles of precious port from 1843 slipped from their broken wooden cradle and shattered on the stone floor. The dark red liquid spread in a wide, glistening pool, looking unnervingly like blood in the flickering lamplight. They tried again, and again. Each thunderous crash only resulted in more destruction of their own property, more valuable wine bleeding out onto the cold stone. By the 4th attempt, the rack was useless, a pile of broken wood and twisted nails. Cornelius and Thomas stood in the center of the cellar, panting, their fine evening clothes soaked with sweat despite the chill. They were surrounded by the wreckage, the sweet, cloying scent of fermented grapes filling the air. The door had not yielded a single inch. It was then that the reality of their physical impotence truly settled in. The door was not just locked, it was a wall. It was a fact of their new existence. They could expend all their energy, destroy all their wealth, and it would not change their situation. They were, for the first time in their lives, completely and utterly powerless. With the failure of their violent attempt, a cold, pragmatic silence fell over the cellar. The immediate panic had passed, replaced by a dawning understanding of their circumstances. Beatrice, ever the practical manager of the household, was the first to speak sensibly. "We should take turns sleeping," she said, her voice steadier now, drawing on a deep well of ingrained habit. "We'll need to preserve the lamp oil, so we'll have periods of darkness. We should establish shifts, keep watch for any sounds above us." It was a good plan, a reasonable plan, the kind of plan that acknowledged a difficult situation while still clinging to the hope of a swift resolution. They all grasped at it, this shred of order, this echo of their former lives where schedules and routines dictated the rhythm of their days. It was a fragile bulwark against the terrifying formlessness of their new reality. Thomas, meanwhile, began to take inventory of their resources with the methodical attention of a merchant, a skill he'd learned from his father but now applied to a ledger of survival. He found a small barrel of water, half full, that Samuel kept for cleaning glasses and wiping down shelves. On a high shelf, tucked away behind a crate of corks, he discovered a few jars of preserved peaches, their golden hue dull in the lamplight, a twist of dried sausages hanging from a hook, and a tin of hardtack crackers, the kind that could last for years. It was a pitifully small hoard. Beatrice revealed the final, psychologically devastating detail. "Samuel kept those down here for his own use," she said quietly, her words hanging in the cold air. "When he came down to retrieve bottles for dinner, he would sometimes eat down here, rather than go back upstairs." The statement landed with the force of a physical blow. The master was now dependent on the servant's secret stash, the scraps he had kept to carve out a few moments of solitude away from their demanding presence. The inversion was absolute. Thomas, the numbers man, began to calculate. The food, if divided into meager portions, might sustain 5 people for a day, perhaps 2 if they were extremely careful and disciplined. The water, if rationed to a few sips per person per shift, would last a little longer, maybe 3 days. But then their eyes were drawn, almost against their will, to the lamp. The flame flickered, a silent visual reminder of another, more pressing deadline. How long would the oil last? 6 hours? 8? No one knew for sure. Cornelius tried to recall the capacity of the lamp's reservoir, but it was a detail he had never needed to know. It was a servant's concern. And then, the unspoken horror, absolute, perfect, suffocating darkness. A windowless stone chamber beneath the earth with, as the first hour bled into the second, their minds began to turn away from the physical problem of the door and towards the man who had put them there. Who was Samuel Oakes? They realized with a growing sense of unease that they did not know. They knew the role he played. They knew the function he performed, but the man himself was a stranger, a silhouette they had never bothered to illuminate. This realization was, in its own way, as chilling as the encroaching cold. They had shared their home, their meals, their most intimate family moments with this man for 15 years, and they could not fathom his motivation. He was always so quiet, Beatrice murmured, hugging herself against the cold, her voice barely more than a whisper that was swallowed by the stones. So efficient. I never had to tell him anything twice. He anticipated our needs before we even voiced them. She said this as if it were a compliment, but in the new context it sounded like a confession of their own blindness. Constance from her stool added her observation, her old eyes reflecting the lamplight like pools of dark water. He watched us all the time, she stated flatly. He was always watching. The thought was deeply unsettling. They had been studied, their habits and patterns meticulously noted, their vulnerabilities catalogued by a man they considered part of the background, as unthinking and reliable as the grandfather clock in the hall. He had been a witness to their lives, and they had never considered what he might be witnessing or what judgment he might be forming. Cornelius paced, the rhythm of his steps a stark counterpoint to the stillness. His mind churned, a merchant going over ledgers, searching for the single error that had led to this catastrophic loss. He remembered something, a small anomaly that had seemed insignificant at the time. 9 months ago, he said slowly too, he words forming carefully as the memory surfaced. Samuel asked if he might have Sunday afternoons free to attend church services in Savannah. Savannah was an 8-mile walk each way, a 16-mile round trip every Sunday for 9 months, a considerable undertaking for a man who worked 6 days a week. What if he wasn't going to church at all? Cornelius wondered aloud, the theory taking shape in the cold air, its implications branching out like cracks in ice. What if he was meeting with abolitionists, learning to read and write, acquiring false papers? The idea was staggering. This was not an act of sudden, impulsive rage. This was a plan, a campaign, meticulously constructed over the better part of a year, executed with flawless precision right under their noses. Every Sunday, Samuel had walked to Savannah and back, patiently, painstakingly building his path to freedom, link by link, while serving them dinner with steady hands and an expressionless face. The betrayal was not in the act itself, but in the patient, secret intelligence that had preceded it. They had been outmaneuvered, not by a brute, but by a strategist. They had mistaken his silence for simplicity, his efficiency for contentment. Now they were forced to reevaluate every interaction, every glance, every seemingly humble "yes, sir," wondering what calculation lay behind it. The man they had owned was a fiction. The real Samuel Oakes was a phantom who had been planning his departure from their world, and in his final act, he had demonstrated a mastery of planning and execution that Cornelius, for all his business acumen, could only now, in his helplessness, truly appreciate. The locked door was not just a piece of wood, it was the final period on a sentence Samuel had been writing for 9 months, perhaps even longer. But why? Margaret's voice broke, the word a plaintive, almost childlike wail that seemed to hang in the cold, still air. Her face, pale in the lamplight, was a mask of genuine, uncomprehending hurt. Why would he do this to us? We treated him well. We never beat him like some masters do. He had good food, clean quarters, respect within the household. She looked from her father to her mother, seeking confirmation, her worldview cracking at the edges. Her question was not a strategic one. It was a plea from a universe where kindness was measured by the absence of overt cruelty, where providing basic sustenance was seen as a generous gift, and where respect meant not being subjected to the lash on a whim. It was the fundamental, flawed logic of their entire system, and in that moment, it echoed with a profound emptiness. The silence that followed her question was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence that demanded an answer they were all unwilling to give. It was Constance who finally broke it, her voice carrying the dry, weary tone of someone who had witnessed the same sins repeated across generations and had long since run out of patience for willful ignorance. "Do you truly not know, child?" she asked, not with malice, but with a devastating matter-of-fact clarity. "Or are you simply unwilling to remember?" Margaret's face flushed a blotchy red in the flickering light. "I don't know what you mean," she insisted, her voice tightening with defensive irritation. Constance spoke a single devastating name, Ruth. The name fell into the cellar not like a stone, but like a seed of poison that instantly bloomed, filling the space with a thick, choking miasma of memory. Ruth Oakes, Samuel's wife. A seamstress whose fingers were gifted with a kind of magic, creating the delicate frost-like needlework on Beatrice's finest gowns. But it hadn't been the end of it, had it? The memory unspooled further, cruel and unrelenting. The wagon arriving, the sound of chains, Ruth, her face a mask of tear-streaked terror, her hands manacled, her swollen belly a tragic curve beneath her thin dress as she was led from the quarters she shared with Samuel. She had looked back once, her eyes scanning the windows of the big house, not in hope, but in a final searing act of witness. And Samuel had been made to continue his duties. He had stood at the sideboard that very evening, his face an impenetrable mask of servitude, his hands steady as he poured the claret into their crystal glasses. He had passed the vegetables, he had cleared the plates, he had performed the pantomime of normalcy while his heart was being loaded onto a wagon bound for a hellish cotton field in Alabama. He had served the people who had just destroyed his world, and he had done it without a flicker of emotion. The lock had been forged in that moment 3 years ago, in the white-hot fire of that betrayal. The click they heard tonight was merely the sound of it finally, decisively, engaging. Samuel had not forgotten. He had been waiting. And his vengeance was not the hot, wild fire of a moment's passion. It was the slow, patient, subterranean fire of a hatred that had been compressed over years into a diamond-hard resolve. The story of Ruth was the central agonizing truth, the gaping wound that explained everything. But as the memory of her terrified face hung in the air, another ghost stirred, summoned by the crumbling of their defenses. Thomas, who had been restlessly testing the doorframe again, stopped. He shifted his weight, his back to the family, and spoke quietly into the wood, as if confessing to the oak itself. "There was that boy," he said, his voice low and strangely thick. "Samuel's brother." The words landed with a different but equally heavy weight. Where Ruth's memory was a story of love and family torn apart, this was a story of potential, of a young mind extinguished. The boy, Elijah, had been perhaps 14, with the same quiet intensity as Samuel, but with a burning, dangerous curiosity in his eyes. He had been caught not with stolen food or shirked work, but with a stolen primer, a child's book of letters hidden in the straw of his pallet. He had been trying to teach himself to read. Cornelius had deemed the transgression not merely disobedience but a fundamental threat. Literacy in an enslaved person was a spark in a powder keg. The punishment, decided by Cornelius and administered by Thomas himself, was to be a public spectacle, a whipping in the yard, a lesson for every other soul on the property about the price of aspiration. Thomas remembered the weight of the whip in his hand, the feel of the braided leather. He remembered the hot, bright sun of that afternoon, the gathered crowd of enslaved faces, their eyes downcast, their silence more accusing than any scream. He remembered Samuel, standing at the very front, his body rigid, his gaze fixed not on Thomas, but on his younger brother, trying to pour his own strength into the boy through that single, unwavering look. Thomas had brought the lash down. He had done his duty. He remembered the sound it made him. Ada, the way the boy's body jerked. He had done it not with rage, but with a cold, procedural determination. It was a job to be done, a problem to be solved. The boy did not cry out. He took his punishment in the same silence his brother had mastered, a silence that now, in retrospect, felt like a condemnation. But the body is fragile. The wounds, crudely treated with brine and herbs by the others in the quarters, had festered. A fever had set in, burning through the boy for 3 days before it finally claimed him. He died in the small, cramped cabin, with Samuel holding his hand, the stolen primer now ashes in the fireplace. "He was just a boy," Thomas said now, his voice barely a whisper. He turned from the door, and in the flickering light his face was pale, his eyes haunted. He was no longer the arrogant heir. He was a man remembering the feel of a lash and the sight of a feverish child. He just wanted to read. This was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a curriculum of cruelty taught by the Whitmores and learned with terrifying perfection by Samuel Oakes. The sale of his pregnant wife was a lesson in the fragility of love. The death of his brother was a lesson in the price of knowledge. They had taught him day after day, year after year, the precise value they placed on his attachments, his intellect, his very soul. And he had been a model student. He had learned the lesson of their power so well that he was now able to teach them a lesson of his own in return. His was not the hot, reckless vengeance of a passionate man. It was the cold, patient, and meticulously calculated vengeance of a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who had been meticulously schooled in the art of loss. He was repaying them, not in kind, but in a currency they could finally understand. Absolute, utter powerlessness. He had taken their lessons, on control, on sequence, on the absolute authority of the master, and he had written his own final examination, and they were locked in the cellar, failing it. Let us now step away from the cold and the growing fear of the wine cellar and follow the footsteps on the gravel drive. Samuel Oakes did not run. He walked with a steady, measured pace, the crunch of the gravel under his boots, a rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic, muffled pounding that was already fading behind him. He carried with him no bundle of stolen silver, no sack of family heirlooms. He carried only his freedom, and it was a weightless, powerful thing, a new element in his blood. The cool night air was a balm, and the vast star-dusted sky overhead felt like a cathedral after the low, oppressive stone ceiling of the cellar. He did not look back at Ashford Manor. There was nothing for him there but ghosts. His plan, gestated over 9 months of Sunday walks, was now in motion, a precise and elegant machine clicking into gear. Those trips to Savannah were not for prayer in a white man's church. They were for meetings in the back rooms of sympathetic free black businessmen, in the secluded clearings along the riverbank, for whispered conversations with men and women who moved through the shadows of the South like ghosts. The Underground Railroad was not a myth. It was a meticulously organized machine of liberation, a nervous system of courage and defiance stretching across the continent, and Samuel had made himself a vital part of its mechanism. On those Sundays, he had not been a servant. He had been a student, a conspirator, a free man in the making. He had acquired papers, beautifully forged, that declared him a freeman named Silas Johnson, a carpenter from Philadelphia. He had practiced the signature until it flowed from his hand without thought. He had memorized the names and descriptions of his contacts, the locations of safe houses, the coded phrases that would identify him as a friend. "I am looking for a man who knows the price of wheat," he would say. The correct response was, "The harvest was bountiful this year." He knew the Whitmore family would not be found until the housemaid returned on Monday morning at the earliest. By then he would be a phantom, swallowed by the vastness of the land. His vengeance was not bloody, but it was absolute. He had not laid a hand on them. He had simply removed his own, the hands that had supported their world for 15 years, the hands that had polished the silver, poured the wine, held the lamp, and closed the door. In doing so, he had collapsed the entire structure of their existence. He had shown them that their power was an illusion, a performance that required his participation. By withdrawing his consent, he had turned their world into a stage with no actors, a play with no audience, a beautiful, empty house with a locked secret festering in its basement. He walked for 2 miles down the dark road before he saw the agreed-upon signal. A lantern with a shuttered lens, flashing twice from the edge of a pine thicket. He turned off the road and was met by a tall, silent man with a wagon loaded with hay. No words were exchanged. Samuel climbed into the back, burrowed deep into the scratchy, sweet-smelling hay, and felt the wagon lurch into motion. He was on his way. He was Silas Johnson now. He was free, and as the wagon carried him north, away from the life he had known, the only thing he left behind for the Whitmores was the silence, the dark, and the crushing weight of their own consequence. He had not just escaped. He had handed them a mirror and locked them in a room with it, forcing them to stare at the reflection of their own deeds until the light went out. Back in the cellar, the most formidable enemy began its final assault, the darkness. The lamp, their tiny, flickering sun, began to die. It was a slow, agonizing process. The flame, which had cast their long, dancing shadows against the bottle-lined walls, now began to sputter and waver. It would shrink to a desperate blue pinpoint, then flare up again in a last gasp of yellow light, each cycle smaller and weaker than the last. This was the true beginning of their psychological descent, the moment the last vestige of their civilized world was extinguished. In the encroaching gloom, the social constructs that had held them together, the unspoken rules of patriarch, dutiful wife, heir, and refined daughter, began to dissolve like sugar in water. The roles they had performed their entire lives were scripts they could no longer read in the dying light. The cold was now a persistent, gnawing presence that had settled deep into their bones. Their fine clothes, the silk, the tailored wool, the delicate lace, were worse than useless against the damp chill of the stone. The fabrics, designed for drawing rooms and dinner parties, wicked the cold from the air and held it against their skin. They huddled together on the cold floor, their bodies shivering uncontrollably, their teeth chattering. The initial shocked unity born of their predicament was giving way to a low, simmering tension. Personal space, a concept of a privileged world, vanished. They were a single shivering organism of fear and discomfort. They took turns sipping from the water barrel, the meager rations a constant, humiliating reminder of their precarious state. The preserved fruit and dried meat were doled out in tiny, unsatisfying portions by Cornelius, who tried to maintain a semblance of order. Each small bite was a painful acknowledgement of their dwindling resources and their dependence on the charity of the Tsisen E-man who had imprisoned them. The darkness outside the lamp's ever-shrinking circle of light felt alive, a physical entity pressing in on them. They were marooned on a small island of light in a sea of impenetrable black, and the island was being systematically erased by the tide. Margaret, whose nerves were frayed to breaking, began to whimper with each sputter of the flame. "It's going out," she whispered, her voice tight with a terror that was more profound than any she had ever known. "Father, it's going out." Cornelius could offer no comfort. He could only watch, his merchant's mind now calculating the depreciation of their last essential asset, light. He knew the moment was coming, and his helplessness in the face of it was a more crushing blow than the failure to break down the door. The door was an external obstacle. The darkness was about to become internal, a state of mind from which there was no escape. Then it happened. The flame gave one final, valiant leap, illuminating for a last second the terrified, pale faces around him. Beatrice's hand clutched at her throat, Thomas's wide, frantic eyes, Margaret's tear-streaked cheeks, Constance's ancient, resigned expression. And then it was gone. The darkness that followed was not merely an absence of light. It was a positive, suffocating presence. It was thick and heavy, filling the space, entering their mouths and noses, pressing against their eyeballs. It was so absolute that it erased the very dimensions of the room. There was no up or down, no left or right. There was only the cold stone beneath them and the sound of their own ragged breathing, which in the perfect silence soon began to sound like the breathing of strangers, of animals, trapped in a hole. They were unmoored from reality itself, cast adrift in a timeless, sensory-deprived void. The last tether to the world they knew had been severed. They were now truly and completely in Samuel's world. The darkness was absolute. It was a physical substance, a velvet blackness so complete it felt like being buried alive. In the first few moments, no one spoke, no one moved. The shock of the sensory void was too profound. Their eyes, straining against the nothingness, conjured phantom lights and swirling patterns that only emphasized the utter lack of visual information. The world had shrunk to the few square inches of cold stone each of them could feel beneath their bodies, and the sound of their own hearts hammering in their ears. This was not the quiet of a library or the peace of a country night. This was the silence of the tomb, a deep, resonant silence that seemed to absorb sound itself, making their own breathing seem obscenely loud. It was Margaret who broke first. A low, guttural moan escaped her lips, escalating quickly into a full-throated scream of pure, undiluted terror. The sound was shocking in the blackness, a raw, animalistic noise that seemed to tear through the fabric of her refined upbringing. She screamed for Samuel, for her father, for God. She screamed until her voice grew hoarse, and the screams devolved into ragged, hysterical sobs. No one tried to comfort her. There were no words in this darkness that could possibly hold any meaning. Her panic was a contagion, and in the void, it spread quickly. Thomas began to curse, a steady, monotonous stream of profanity directed at Samuel, at his father, at the door, at the darkness itself. His voice was tight with a fear that was rapidly curdling into rage. Cornelius tried to exert control. "Quiet," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos, but it lacked its former power. It was just a voice in the dark, stripped of the authority that had always been backed by wealth and position. "We must remain calm. We must conserve our energy." But his words were empty, the advice of a man who had never been dumb. And in a situation where energy was all he had left, how could one conserve energy when the very darkness was consuming their sanity? Beatrice wept silently, her body shaking with quiet tremors. She was mourning not just their predicament, but the irreversible loss of the world she had known. The orderly universe of Ashford Manor, of social calls and managed households, was gone, revealed as a flimsy stage set. Then, the hallucinations began. It started subtly. Thomas swore he heard a faint scratching from the far corner, like rats or fingernails on stone. Margaret, between sobs, insisted she could hear someone whispering her name, a sibilant hiss that seemed to come from just behind her. Cornelius, straining his ears, became convinced he could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock from the hallway above, a cruel phantom of normalcy. Their minds, deprived of external stimuli, were turning inward, projecting their guilt and fear onto the blank canvas of the dark. The line between the physical reality of the cellar and the psychological landscape of their own terror was blurring, then dissolving altogether. They were no longer 5 people in a room. They were 5 isolated consciousnesses, each trapped in a private hell of their own making, haunted by the ghosts Samuel Oakes had left them with. The darkness was not empty, it was crowded with memories, and every one of them was a condemnation. As the first full day passed, or what they perceived to be a day, a new and more primal tormentor took command of their suffering: thirst. The initial shock and fear had been mental and emotional storms, but thirst was a purely physical tyranny. It began as a dry stickiness in their mouths, a minor inconvenience, but it grew. It became a persistent, nagging ache at the back of their throats. Their tongues felt thick and clumsy, like foreign objects of leather and dust. They began to think of the small water barrel not as a resource, but as a deity, its contents a sacred elixir that held the power over life itself. The rationing, once a practical strategy, now became a source of intense, silent conflict. When Cornelius would carefully dole out a few precious sips to each family member in the impenetrable dark, the sound of another person swallowing was a torment. It was impossible to know if someone was taking more than their share, and the suspicion festered in the silence. And they were surrounded by liquid. This was the final, exquisite cruelty of their prison. Thousands of dollars worth of wine sat in dark bottles on the shelves, mere feet away. In the absolute blackness, they could not see them, but they knew they were there. They could feel their presence. They could, in their heightened state, almost smell the tannins and the faint sweetness of the aged grapes through the glass. Their minds tormented them with memories of tastings, of toasts, of the rich, complex flavors of a good year. But they also knew, on some fundamental level, that the alcohol would be their doom. It would dehydrate them further, accelerating the very process that was consuming them. It would cloud their judgment, pushing them further into the madness that already lapped at the edges of their minds. The wine was a siren's call, a beautiful, poisonous temptation that promised momentary relief, at the cost of certain ruin. The very symbol of their opulence, the collection Cornelius had curated with such pride, had become a taunting mirage. It was a treasure chest they could not open, a feast they could not consume. In their former lives, these bottles represented connoisseurship, status, and the good life. Now they represented nothing but the absolute uselessness of their wealth in the face of a basic biological need. Samuel had not just locked them in a cellar, he had locked them in a brutal philosophical lesson. He had forced them to confront the true hierarchy of value. A single cup of clean water was now worth more than every bottle of Chateau Margaux in the room. The system they had built, where human beings could be bought and sold like wine, was being inverted. Here, in the dark, the most basic element of life was priceless, and their most valuable possessions were worthless. The psychological weight of this understanding was immense. Every moment of thirst was a reminder of their miscalculation, a reminder that the foundation of their world was built on a lie. They were starving and thirsting within sight of a feast that was not only inaccessible, but would actively destroy them. Every elegant label, every prized vintage, was a mockery of their predicament, a testament to the brilliant, cruel completeness of Samuel's revenge. The family structure, the last remaining pillar of their old lives, began to crumble under the relentless grinding strain. The hunger, the thirst, the cold, and the endless oppressive darkness acted like acid, dissolving the bonds of civility and affection that had held them together. The performance of being a good family, the respectful son, the doting mother, the authoritative father, was a play that required an audience and a stage. In the dark there was neither. There were only 5 desperate primal creatures, their instincts for survival slowly overwhelming a lifetime of conditioning. The first fracture appeared over the water. The careful rationing system established by Cornelius depended on trust, but trust is a fragile commodity in the dark, where every sound is amplified and every sip taken by another is a perceived theft. Thomas, whose throat felt as if it had been packed with sand and broken glass, could no longer bear the agony. During what he guessed was his watch, he crept toward the barrel. The sound of his movement was like a thunderclap in the silence. "Thomas?" Cornelius's voice rasped from the darkness. "What are you doing?" "Nothing, Father," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "Just adjusting my position." They all heard the distinct hollow sound of the dipper striking the inside of the barrel. It was a sound that condemned him. "You liar!" Margaret shrieked, her voice raw and shrill. "You're taking more water!" A scuffle erupted in the blackness. There was the sound of grunting, of bodies colliding with the stone floor, of a pained cry as someone was struck. Cornelius had lunged toward the sound of his son. He couldn't see, but he connected with a solid mass, and he struck out, his fist meeting flesh with a sickening thud. It was the sound of a father beating his heir, the sound of a dynasty turning on itself. The fight was bright, a frantic, clumsy tangle in the absolute dark, but its significance was eternal. The social contract was shattered. Afterward, a new silence fell, heavier and more terrible than before. It was a silence of shame, of acknowledged betrayal. Beatrice wept, not for their physical plight, but for the loss of the family she thought she had. The bonds of love and respect were proving to be as fragile as the glass of the shattered port bottles. They retreated into their own private miseries, no longer a unit, but a collection of isolated individuals sharing the same stone tomb. The conversations ceased. There was nothing left to say. The darkness had taken their sight, the thirst was taking their strength, and now the suspicion had taken their last comfort, each other. They were alone together, each trapped in a private hell, listening to the sounds of the other's suffering and feeling nothing but a cold, growing resentment. The civilized people they had been were gone, stripped away layer by layer, revealing the raw, terrified animals beneath. Hallucinations began to bloom in the fertile ground of their deprivation and guilt. In the endless, featureless black, their minds, starved for external stimulus, turned inward and began to project their deepest fears and regrets onto the blank canvas of the dark. It started with sounds. Thomas, curled in a ball on the cold stone, was the first to break the long silence. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice thin and strained. "That crying. It's a baby." The others, lost in their own agony, initially ignored him. But the sound persisted in his mind, a faint, mewling wail that seemed to come from the corner where the broken wine rack lay. It was the cry of the child he had helped condemn, the son of Samuel and Ruth, a child who had been sold before it ever drew breath. The phantom sound was a needle of ice in his brain, and he began to rock back and forth, his hands pressed over his ears, trying to block out a noise that existed only in the prison of his memory. Margaret was next. She began to whisper to someone none of them could see. "I'm sorry," she would murmur. "I didn't know. The yellow silk. It wasn't that important." She was speaking to Ruth, the seamstress. In her mind, Ruth was there, sitting just beyond the circle of their huddled bodies, her head bent over her needlework, humming one of those soft, sorrowful spirituals. Margaret could hear the melody perfectly, each note a tiny, precise accusation. She would offer frantic, rambling apologies for her vanity, for her demands, for her casual cruelty, her words tumbling into the darkness and receiving no answer but the suffocating silence. Cornelius was tormented by a different sound, the distinct metallic click of the lock. In his mind, it happened over and over again. Click. Then the sound of Samuel's retreating footsteps. Click. Then the footsteps. It was a loop of his own powerlessness, a recording of the moment his world ended, playing on an endless reel in the theater of his broken mind. He would lurch toward the door, convinced that the sound had been real this time, only to collide with the unyielding oak, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. Even Beatrice and Constance were not spared. Beatrice began to smell gardenias, her mother's favorite flower, a scent so vivid and out of place in the dank cellar that it made her weep with a confused, aching longing for a simpler past. Constance, the most stoic of them, simply began to recite the Lord's Prayer over and over, her voice a dry rustle, as if she were preparing for a judgment she now knew was inevitable. Their reality had not just fractured, it had shattered. The boundary between memory, nightmare, and the present moment had completely dissolved. They were no longer in the year 1856, trapped in a wine cellar in Georgia. They were in a timeless purgatory of their own making, a shared space of psychological torment haunted by the ghosts of the people they had broken to build their comfortable world at Ashford Manor. Samuel's vengeance was not physical. It was metaphysical. He had forced them to be alone with the consequences of their actions, and in the silence and the dark, those consequences had taken on form and voice. They were not just starving and thirsting in the dark, they were being devoured slowly and systematically by the manifestations of their own sins. The human body is resilient, a machine of astonishing endurance, but the human spirit is a more fragile instrument. They could perhaps survive the thirst, the hunger, the cold. But the unending psychological assault, the erosion of their sanity and the absolute blackness, was breaking them down from the inside in a way that physical deprivation never could. They stopped speaking to each other entirely. The scuffle over the water had been the last communication, the final exchange of a family that no longer existed. Now they retreated into the solitary confinement of their own minds. The cellar was no longer a room, it was a state of being, a landscape of pure regret and fear, where time had no meaning and hope was a forgotten language. They lost all track of how long they had been there. The initial desperate counting of hours, marked by the imagined shifting of watch duties, had long since given way to a formless, endless suffering. Was it the second night, the third? They had no way of knowing. The world had shrunk to the few square feet of cold, unforgiving stone they could feel around them, the pervasive taste of dust and despair in their mouths, and the ragged, labored sound of their own breathing. Their bodies were weakening. The lack of water was causing headaches that throbbed in time with their heartbeats, their muscles cramped from the cold and inactivity. The small portions of food did little to quiet the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, an emptiness that was beginning to feel permanent. They were waiting, but they no longer knew what they were waiting for. The concept of rescue had become abstract, a story they had once been told about a world that may not have ever existed. It felt as distant and mythical as heaven. The line between waiting for rescue and waiting for an end to the torment had begun to blur. An awful, passive acceptance was settling over them, a resignation that was more terrifying than their earlier panic. Panic was a reaction, a fight against the dying of the light. This silence was a surrender. In the darkness, their identities continued to dissolve. Cornelius was no longer a patriarch, he was a dry throat and a mind haunted by a locking mechanism. Thomas was no longer an heir. He was a pair of ears tormented by a phantom infant's cry. Margaret was no longer a socialite. She was a voice whispering apologies to a ghost. Beatrice was no longer a lady of the manor. She was a sense of smell, hallucinating flowers, clinging to a memory of beauty. Constance was no longer a matriarch. She was a whispered prayer on a loop. They had been stripped of everything that defined them, their roles, their wealth, their authority, their family bonds. All that remained was the base animal, suffering in the void, and the crushing, inescapable weight of their own complicity. This was the ultimate terrifying power of Samuel's act. He had not just imprisoned their bodies, he had systematically dismantled their minds and erased their very selves. He had reduced them to their barest, most pathetic components, leaving them with nothing but the consequences of their lives to keep them company in the dark. Monday morning arrived, bright and unassuming, over Ashford Manor. The sun rose, burning away the night's chill from the fields. A young housemaid named Eliza, returning from her weekend visiting her own family in a nearby settlement, walked up the gravel drive, her small bag in hand. The profound silence that greeted her was the first wrong note. The grand house was never silent. There was always the hum of activity, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the sound of a broom on hardwood. This silence was thick and heavy, a physical presence. She called out a timid, "Hello?" as she entered the back hallway. Her voice echoed through the empty rooms, receiving no answer but the faint creak of the floorboards under her own feet. A deep, instinctual unease settled over her. She moved through the lower floor, her footsteps too loud in the stillness. Everything was in its place, spotless and orderly, yet the life was gone. It felt like a beautiful corpse. It took several hours, and the gathering of the other returning staff, the cook, the stable hand, before their collective anxiety overcame their fear of overstepping. They searched the main floors, calling the Whitmores' names with increasing desperation. It was the cook, Mrs. Higgins, a practical woman with a grim disposition who thought of the wine cellar. "Perhaps they're down there," she suggested, though the idea felt flimsy even to her. They found the cellar door shut. The stable hand, a large man named Jed, tried the handle. It was locked. He called out, pressing his ear to the wood. At first there was nothing. Then a sound, not a shout or a cry for help, but a low, broken whimper, so faint it was almost inaudible. It was the sound of a soul that had been worn down to its last frayed thread. That sound, more than any shout, filled them with a cold dread. They had to find the key. A frantic search of the house commenced, but the key was not on its hook in the pantry, nor in Cornelius's study. It was days later that a field hand would find it, discarded in the mud by the main road, a small, cold piece of metal that had decided the fate of 5 people. With no key, Jed had to fetch tools. He returned with a heavy pry bar and a sledgehammer. The sound of metal striking wood and iron echoed through the quiet house, a violent intrusion. It took considerable time and effort to splinter the oak around the lock and break the mechanism. Finally, with a wrenching crack, the door gave way. As it swung inward, the smell that poured out was a complex, foul mixture of spilled wine, cold stone, and the distinct, sweetish odor of human suffering. The scene that greeted them in the dim light from the hallway was not one of violent chaos. It was a tableau of slow, quiet dissolution. The Whitmore family was found alive, but they were irrevocably broken. They were huddled together, not for comfort, but like shipwreck survivors clinging to the same piece of driftwood. They were emaciated, their faces gaunt and smudged with dirt, their fine clothes torn and stained. Their eyes, when they slowly, painfully turned toward the light, were wide, vacant, and held a terror that seemed to have been permanently etched onto their souls. They did not cry out in relief. They did not rush for the door. They simply stared, blinking against the unfamiliar light as if they were looking at something from a dream or a nightmare from which they could not fully wake. The 4 days in the dark, confronted by the full, crushing weight of their actions and their absolute powerlessness, had hollowed them out. The people they had been, the confident, powerful masters of their domain, were gone, erased as completely as if they had never existed. They were ghosts in their own home, forever haunted by the memory of the cellar and the man who had turned their world into a tomb. Samuel Oakes was never found. He vanished from the state of Georgia as completely as a drop of water vanishing into a river. The local authorities, when notified by a shaken and traumatized Cornelius Whitmore days later, conducted a perfunctory search. Posters were printed with a vague description, but there was no daguerreotype, no accurate rendering of his face. He was just another enslaved man who had run away, a common enough occurrence that failed to stir much passion, especially with the Whitmore family's strange, hushed account of the event. The official story, the one that eventually seeped into the community, was sanitized. It spoke of a deranged servant, a tragic accident, a family trapped by a malfunctioning lock. The deeper, more disturbing truth, the calculated patience, the psychological torment, the poetic justice of it all, was a story too dangerous to tell. It was a narrative that questioned the very foundation of their society, a story that was, in its own way, locked away in a different kind of cellar, the cellar of collective, uncomfortable memory. What became of him? We can only follow the logical path of the plan he so meticulously constructed. The man known as Samuel Oakes ceased to exist the moment the cellar door clicked shut. In his place was Silas Johnson, a freeman from Philadelphia, a carpenter by trade. The forged papers he carried, acquired during those 9 months of Sunday pilgrimages, were his passport to a new life. The network of the Underground Railroad, that silent, courageous machine, would have shepherded him from safe house to safe house, moving under the cover of darkness, guided by the North Star. He likely crossed into a free state, perhaps Ohio or Pennsylvania, his heart pounding not with fear but with a fierce, quiet triumph. He would have found work with his hands, not as a servant, but as a craftsman, building things instead of maintaining them. Perhaps he saved his money, found a small community, and even in time started a new family. His children would have been born free. They would have known their father as a quiet, determined man, a man who never spoke of his past. They would not have known the weight of the chains he had worn, nor the brilliant cold fire of the vengeance he had exacted to break them. He walked away from Ashford Manor not just with his life, but with his future. He had taken it back from the people who had stolen it, and in doing so, he had ensured that the name Whitmore would forever be associated with a locked door and a terrible, self-inflicted darkness, while the name he chose for himself, Silas Johnson, meant freedom. The story of the Whitmore family became a local legend, a ghost story whispered about in the Georgia Lowcountry, but its details were blurred by time and unease. It was a tale that didn't fit the simple narratives of the antebellum South. It was too complex. It presented an enslaved man not as a brute or a simpleton, but as an intellectual and strategic equal, a man of profound patience and profound wrath. It revealed the master not as a benevolent patriarch or a cruel tyrant, but as a fragile, pathetic figure whose power was a collective illusion. This was a truth that was too dangerous to be widely known. It was a spark that could ignite a fire. So the story was suppressed, not by any official decree, but by a silent communal agreement to forget the uncomfortable parts, to remember only the tragedy and not the cause. It was a story that asked difficult questions about justice, vengeance, and the true nature of the relationship between the powerful and the powerless. It revealed an unbearable truth, that the entire system of mastery was a fragile performance, a play that could only continue as long as the enslaved consented to play the heir part. And when that consent was violently, silently, and intelligently withdrawn, the master was left as helpless and terrified as a child in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. So, what is the final judgment on this story? Was Samuel Oakes a criminal? A murderer by proxy condemning 5 people to a slow psychological death? Or was he an agent of a higher justice, a cosmic balancing of scales in a world where the legal scales were permanently weighted against him? He did not kill the Whitmores with his own hands. He did not wield a knife or a club. He did not poison their food. His weapon was knowledge. His violence was structural. He placed them in a situation where the full logical conclusion of their own system, a system built on isolation, control, and the treatment of human beings as property, was turned back upon them with the precision of a master engineer. He made them experience the powerlessness they had inflicted. He made them feel the cage, not from the outside looking in, but from the inside, with the door irrevocably locked. in a world that denied him any legal recourse, any rights, any humanity before the law, he crafted a form of justice that was as elegant as it was brutal. It was a justice that did not come from a court of law, but from the court of consequence, the one court from which no one, not even the wealthiest plantation owner, can ever appeal. Consider the evidence he presented. The sale of his pregnant wife, Ruth, the death of his brother, Elijah, from a punishment for the crime of literacy. These were not mere grievances, they were capital crimes against his soul for which there was no earthly judge. The Whitmore family was the prosecution, the judge, and the jury in their own case. Samuel simply became the executioner of the sentence they themselves had passed. His method was not to spill blood, but to hold up a mirror. He forced them to sit in the dark and stare at the reflection of their own deeds until the image was burned permanently onto their minds. He showed them that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, a law of physics that applies to human morality as well. They had sold his family. He took away theirs, not by killing them, but by forcing the bonds of their family to disintegrate under pressure until they were attacking each other over sips of water. They had believed his brother's mind was dangerous. He showed them how fragile their own minds truly were when stripped of comfort and light. He repaid them in a currency they could finally understand, their own helplessness. This was not the wild, chaotic vengeance of a passionate man. This was the cold, patient, and meticulously calculated retribution of a man who had been meticulously schooled in the art of loss and the mechanics of power. He had learned their system, understood its every weakness, and then used its own rules to destroy it for them. He stopped playing the game that was rigged against him and instead changed the rules so completely that they never even knew a new game had begun until they were already losing. His was the most profound form of power. The power to redefine the reality of those who believed they controlled his. This story is not just a dark, forgotten chapter from a brutal history. It is a living lesson in the permanent architecture of power. The mechanisms Samuel Oakes understood and weaponized are not confined to 1856. They are eternal. There are locks everywhere, even today, not just on physical doors, but on your perception, on your understanding of the world, on the very boundaries of what you believe is possible. The systems we live within, the sprawling corporate structures, the carefully managed political narratives, the unspoken social hierarchies, they are all doors. You are told constantly that these doors are for your protection. They are there to keep chaos out, to maintain order, to provide a framework for your life. You are encouraged to stay on your side of the door, to trust that the room you are in is the only room, and that the people who control the lock have your best interests at heart. But the story of Samuel Oakes reminds us of a fundamental, dangerous truth. Every lock has two sides. The true power in any system never lies in being inside the room. The ultimate power lies in controlling the mechanism. Samuel understood this at a visceral level. He was born on the wrong side of the lock, in a room he never chose. For 15 years he played his part. He obeyed the rules of the room. He made the lives of those inside more comfortable. But he never forgot that the lock existed, and he never stopped planning for the day he would either possess the key or render the lock irrelevant. He stopped playing the game that was rigged against him and instead changed the rules. He demonstrated that the power of the master was not inherent. It was contingent. It depended entirely on the cooperation, willing or forced, of the enslaved. The moment that cooperation was intelligently, silently withdrawn, the master's power evaporated, revealing the terrified, helpless human being underneath the costume of authority. This is the lesson that resonates across the centuries. It asks you to look at the doors in your own life. Who holds the keys to your financial security, your access to information, your health, your mobility? Are you trusting that the door will always open for you because you are on the right side? Samuel's story is a warning against that complacency. It teaches that the only real security, the only true freedom, lies not in being inside the room, but in understanding the lock. It lies in knowing how it works, who controls it, and having a plan for what you will do if it one day clicks shut, trapping you inside with the echoes of your own assumptions. The Whitmores believed their wealth and social standing were their protection. They discovered that those things were just decorations on the walls of a prison they had built for themselves. The real power was, and always will be, in the hands of the one who understands the lock. Samuel didn't just escape his prison, he proved it was a prison by locking his jailers inside and throwing away the key. The Whitmore family survived their physical ordeal, but they were forever changed, their spirits broken in a way that no physician could mend. They had looked into the abyss of their own making, and the abyss had looked back, leaving a permanent shadow in their eyes. Ashford Manor for them was no longer a home. It was a monument to their own fragility, a beautiful hollow shell that echoed with the memory of a metallic click and the scent of spilled wine. They tried to resume their lives, but the performance was over. Cornelius could no longer command respect. His voice now carried the tremor of a man who had screamed into an unhearing void. Beatrice's management of the household became listless, the fine china and polished silver now seeming like relics from a civilization that had collapsed. Thomas was plagued by a nervous condition, jumping at sudden sounds, forever hearing the phantom cry of a child that never was. Margaret retreated into a near-total silence, her former sharpness replaced by a vacant stare. Only Constance seemed relatively unchanged, as if her aged eyes had already foreseen this inevitable conclusion to their story. The story serves as a stark and enduring reminder that no structure of power is permanent. Empires, institutions, and social hierarchies are not monoliths. They are delicate ecosystems maintained by a complex web of consent, tradition, and the implied threat of force. But when the consent is intelligently withdrawn, when the tradition is revealed to be a convenient fiction, and when the force is met with a greater, more patient intelligence, the entire structure can collapse in an instant. It can fall with a sound no louder than a key turning in a lock. The Whitmore's authority was not overthrown by an army or a court order. It was nullified by the quiet, deliberate action of one man who simply refused to participate in his own subjugation any longer. He demonstrated that their power was not a tangible force but a collective agreement, an agreement he revoked. In the years that followed, the name Samuel Oakes was never spoken aloud in Ashford Manor. He became a non-person, an erased history. But his absence was more powerful than his presence had ever been. Every locked door in the house was a reminder. Every sip of water was a silent acknowledgement of the thirst they had known. The wine cellar itself was bricked up not out of anger, but out of a superstitious terror, as if they were entombing a malevolent spirit. They became prisoners of the memory, long after the physical prison had been left behind. They lived out their days in the gilded cage of their property, forever glancing over their shoulders, forever listening for footsteps that weren't there, forever trapped by the psychological victory of the man who had walked away. Their wealth insulated them from want, but it could not protect them from the truth he had forced them to learn, that the master is always and only as powerful as the servant allows him to be. The final image, then, is not of the family in the cellar, nor of Samuel walking to freedom. It is of the key itself, a simple forged piece of metal, cold and inert, discarded in the Georgia mud. It was just a tool. It held no morality, no conscience, no inherent allegiance. Its power was bestowed upon it entirely by the hands that held it and the doors it could open or close. In Samuel's hand, it was an instrument of liberation and retribution. In the Whitmore's world, it had been a symbol of control they never imagined could be turned against them. This is the ultimate lesson. Power is not a substance you own. It is a function you perform. It is a current that flows through the structures we build, and it can be redirected by anyone who understands the wiring. The question this story leaves you with is a simple one, and it will linger long after the tale is told, because it applies to the invisible architecture of your own life. In the systems you navigate every day, the corporate ladder, the political landscape, the social contracts, which side of the lock are you on? Are you the one who trusts the door will always open for you, who believes the room you are in is the only reality? Or are you the one who understands that the only real autonomy, the only true security, lies in comprehending the mechanism itself? The story of Samuel Oakes is a permanent warning against complacency. It forces you to ask the most dangerous question of all. Who holds your key? And what will you do if you one day hear the click of a lock you never knew existed?